Okay, hello. Hello to everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's wonderful to see such a global audience. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all today for the panel Unsettling Settler Diplomacy, International Cultural Relations in a Decolonizing World. My name is Sarah Smith, and I'm the Canada Research Chair in Art, Culture, and Global Relations and an Associate Professor at Western University, where I work as an uninvited guest on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinanton nations on lands that are connected to the London Township and Samva Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. I'm joining you today virtually near the banks of the Deshkan-Zibing or Antler River, which is colonially known as the Thames. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, who are contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to society.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lynda Jessup. I'm a Vice Dean and Professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, where I live and work as an uninvited guest on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies. It's also to acknowledge this territory's significance for the Indigenous peoples who live and continue to live upon it, and whose practices and spiritualities are tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to territory and its other inhabitants today. Can I have the first slide, please? Of pertinence to our discussion today is the inclusion of this territory in a dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant, a centuries-old agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee to care for the resources around the Great Lakes and to share them through diplomacy and respect for one another's sovereignty as nations. It's a political concept that has informed international relations among Indigenous peoples in the region since its inception. And by extension, relations forged in treaties with Europeans beginning in the 17th century. As Montreal-based artist Nadia Meyer puts it, a dish with one spoon wampum speaks to Indigenous protocol. It speaks to how Indigenous peoples inhabit and share the space together. Negotiating, as she puts it, is about resituating the understanding between all the different players in the area.
And that brings us to our discussion today. We're really delighted to have you all here with us for this session, which, as you might know, is one of 4 online events that comprises the International Cultural Relations Research Alliance, or ICRRA's 2024 conference titled Decolonial Practices in International Cultural Relations, Building Trust. Lynda and I are both members of ICRRA, which is a network of scholars and practitioners that brings together global research and insights into the theory and practice of international cultural relations. So what we're really talking about is ways of working globally in the areas of the arts, education, and civil society to build trust and understanding, to promote collaboration, and to enhance and sustain dialogue between peoples and cultures. Now, our conference this year comes together to acknowledge that cultural relations is still largely shaped by legacies of colonialism, with an aim to advance more inclusive and representative frameworks for the field. Historical reflection is essential, as are practices of relearning. The conference aims to provide a place for dialogue that is not intended to be a final answer or all-encompassing, but a moment and an ongoing commitment to address post-colonial approaches and decolonial practices in the field. So we're very much looking forward to being in conversation with all of you over the course of today and the conference. With us today, our panelists are Indigenous scholars, artists, researchers who engage the theory and practice of Indigenous diplomacies in their own diverse practices. In so doing, our panelists bring attention to the larger field of diplomatic activity in which state-based cultural relations is but one type. This expansive field of international activity is one in which Indigenous nations interact with one another and with what political anthropologist Audra Simpson refers to as the still settling Euro-Atlantic community. So, as researchers who are engaged in international cultural relations, which emphasizes people to people relations, reciprocity, and long term outlook, we approach today with a stated distance between ourselves and diplomacy proper, with its ties to the short term interests of states and their policy goals. Instead, Lynn and I see ourselves as bringing a critically informed understanding of culture to our work. At the same time, of course, we need to recognize that there's limits to the criticality of Western disciplinary formations that created us, and that despite our criticality, we remain largely unaware of our implication in the politics of states that underpin the building and management of cultural relations globally. So, in other words, we suggest that research in and practice of international cultural relations needs to acknowledge that the idea of culture's neutrality is a myth, or what we need to do is disabuse ourselves of the perception of culture as a benign entity through which cultural relations practitioners advance long-term goals seemingly independent of the strategic interests of the state. Instead, we suggest cultural workers are always already implicated in the politics of the state. As such, we call for culture workers to recognize and engage in the larger field of diplomatic activity, and thus acknowledge their own positionality within it.
We're thrilled to be in conversation today with four distinguished guests. Joining us are historian Alan Corbiere and artists Alan Nicholson, Skawanati, and Jeff Thomas. Thank you all for being here. Our three artists are all from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the people of the Longhouse, consisting of the Six Nations known in English as the Seneca, Cayuga, Tuscarora, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. Our historian today, Alan Corbiere, is an Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe are a group of First Nations occupying a wide territory and land claimed by Canada and the United States, with a concentration around the Great Lakes. Now, given the international audience is with us today, we wanted to show you a slide to provide context. See the little dot there is the pin in our globe. Shows you we are here. Is there a way to zoom in on that? No? Okay. So if you just squint there, you can see the Great Lakes in the middle of North America. I draw your attention to that because the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee's traditional territories are located around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, which, to provide further context, the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes are bisected by the Canada-US border. Now, if you're interested in more information about this, in the chat, we'll provide you a link to Native Land Digital, so you can look at this more closely. Slide. Now, in thinking about how to best organize this panel, we decided to structure the event as a conversation. We see this as in keeping with the aim of the ICRRA conference to foster engagement and connection, in contrast to a more formal series of presentations where speakers share their work but might not necessarily have an opportunity to find points of connection. Now, we hope this conversational structure allows for links to be made between and across the various perspectives our panelists will share today. Now, to give our speakers some guidance and prompt conversation, we've come up with 3 rounds of questions. Broadly speaking, one on wampum, one about Indigenous diplomacies, and one about the role of art in these contexts. Each speaker will be able to respond to the prompts, and we also hope to encourage speakers to reflect and respond to each other to keep things conversational. Now, at the end, we hope to have time for audience questions. So if you have questions as we go along, please add them to the chat and we'll go back and look at these. Our hope is to bring them forward and to use them at the end to hear further from our panelists. If I could, Alan Corbiere, where did you go? I have to find you on my screen. There you are. Alan, wampum are tied to oral traditions of Indigenous diplomacies. And we wanted to start with you as a historian to get some perspective on the meaning and significance and function of wampum.
Thank you for the invitation. Nin so ujik combinando them mompim chigging donjaba. I'm I'm from the reserve called Michigan in Ontario, and I thank the organizers for the invitation. Wampum is a mnemonic device, as you know, and on it are figures, a cohort of figures that were understood internationally by different nations, particularly Haudenosaunee, Mohegan, Anishinaabe, and even the Sioux. So there, what we're looking at are a system of communication that goes from the eastern seaboard out to the Mississippi. And then what we also have is a movement from the Mississippi to the eastern seaboard. And this movement, of course, one way is wampum, the other way are pipes and quill work, and the other is wampum beads and colors. So what we have are these two systems come together. The pipes have been brought by Siouan speaking people, and those pipes actually go like last summer. I went to Ganondagan, which is a cultural education center in Seneca Territory out by Buffalo. And on display there is a Calumet pipe. And the Haudenosaunee, by and large, do not use these long stemmed Calumet pipes. But that's how far this diplomacy and this method of making meaning spanned. But the pipe that's there is actually wrapped with porcupine quills and are colored in different manners. And each of those colors, of course, the color pattern means a specific message that goes with that pipe. Likewise, on the other hand, the people use wampum belts to interact with through the Anishinaabe to the Sauk and Fox people out on the western shores of Lake Michigan, and then out eventually to the Sioux people that are just at the edge of the Mississippi. So it took some time to actually get a set of symbols that were recognized by all of these groups. And because what I mentioned is the Sioux people, of course, are part of a Siouan language, and the Anishinaabe are part of an Algonquian language family, and the Iroquoian people, all the six that you named, as well as the Huron-Wendat, are all are three language families that are not related. So they all needed a system in place to actually to actually converse with each other in a way that was mutually understandable. And the way they did this, of course, you will read about the use of gestures and sign language, but also the way to do it was through material culture, and that being the exchange of clothing, the decorating of clothing, the symbols that were put on clothing, but those symbols that are on clothing are also sometimes put on those pipe stems. And then sometimes those symbols that are on pipe stems, particularly diamonds and what we would now call hourglass figures, also occur on wampum belts. And these wampum belts, of course, the amount of symbols uh, that were used and manipulated at the beginning seemingly the older belts seemingly were more abstract and geometric shape. And then later on, as time went on and the French got on board with this system and the British got on board with this system and eventually the Americans, the belts took on a more figurative aspect. So you eventually have this George Washington belt that the Haudenosaunee have, and it's the 13 colonies and represented by men holding hands, linking arms, I should say. and then the White House in the middle. And then what you showed earlier, that dish with one spoon belt, that's a real bare minimum symbol. And all it is purple and white. And people had to make meaning with that. And actually, if you read a lot of the different archival collections of council proceedings between different communities, you will see that the Mohegans talked about a dish. They talked about the land and the community as their dish. And if you get a chance, speaking to anybody in the audience, to read Lisa Brooks' book, The Common Pot, that will shed light on how extensive this metaphor was. So the metaphor was used in speaking to each other, and the all the way from the West Coast, I mean the East Coast out to the Mississippi. And then the Sauk and Fox also referred to that just after the War of 1812 in a council that they had in a council with the British. They said that we 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 still want to look at this land as our dish, as our one dish. So this symbol there, the one thing about that belt that you just showed is it has the white in the middle of it is supposed to be the tail of a beaver. So of course, in later iterations, uh, people actually wove a beaver onto the belt. But back then, this this actually doesn't look like a beaver at all. You don't know that. If you just come in here and look at that belt, you don't know what it is. So you have to actually have the background knowledge that goes with those symbols are and what the talk is on the belt. So when you look at all these different symbols and you look later on, you'll see, well, if you ever get a chance to see, you'll see that the prolific use of hexagons in wampum belts, but also on decorations of pipes and as well as diamonds. And these diamonds represented a council fire, but it also represented a nation. And then the squares represented villages, and then the rectangles represented mats. And these quote unquote mats were also a representation, a figurative and metaphoric representation of what people would call their country. So when they spoke in council, the Anishinaabe people, when in the going to 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal, they approached the French, and they had said, "I see that you rolled out your mat and you kindled your fires." And this was meaning that they were ready, the French were ready to receive them. So back then, of course, now people have sometimes they'll have a trailer that they take and they go camping somewhere, or they have a tent. But back then, you had your canoe and you had your mat, and you rolled out your mat when you had to go and sleep somewhere. So this mat became a metaphor for not only your bed, but your country and where you would repose, and then also where you could relax. And if somebody extended the mat to you, then that actually became a way of welcoming you into their country. So we had basically a cadre of symbols, and earlier on, I would argue, earlier on, they were geometric shapes. And then when the French and the British, they introduced the alphabet. So we have a number of wampum belts that actually are made to the Virgin Mary, and to also to they have lieutenant governor's initials on there. But then they started introducing dates as well. One of our famous belts for Western Confederacy, Anishinaabe people, Ojibwe Odawa, it says 1764 on there. So they introduced those numbers. So this became a system of symbols that was already extant in the Great Lakes area, but then it kept evolving, and then the French people added onto it, the British added onto it, and the Americans added onto it. But it was the first part of it was, of course, inter-indigenous, the Sioux, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people, as well as the Sauk, Fox, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk people. So and the Miami, of course, and Illinois and others. So there's a great number of people that ascribe to this, as well as the Mohegans and Susquehanna, that were part of this system. And they too understood and manipulated those systems as they came across the from the east to west, and then also going from west to east. That's the part I guess I wanted to really emphasize, was this, that it wasn't just a one-way
Yeah.
interaction and introduction of symbols. It was a multi-directional influences that came to develop this system of diplomacy that was uh, manifested on wampum belts, but also on the pipe stems, as well as the use of feathers that were draped on the pipe, as well as the feathers and cloth that adorned the pipe stem, as well as the way the pipe bowl itself was carved. So there's a lot of different meaning the way different people interacted, uh, bringing that pipe to different people. So I was just reading one uh, book the other night, and they had talked about how usually the calumet was sacrosanct, and that nobody violated it. But they said, well, that's in theory, that's what it was supposed to be. And same with wampum, that nobody was supposed to um, violate a wampum. But on both extremities, so they said the Haudenosaunee didn't really invest as much power in that Calumet pipe, and likewise the Sioux didn't invest as much uh, uh, value or sacrosanct, hold it as sacrosanct as the Haudenosaunee did, because they were at both extreme ends of this area around this perimeter around the Great Lakes. So
Okay.
these
Oh, sorry.
symbols, these symbols developed over a good amount of time, and through years of meeting together and sharing together in adjacent areas. So that's the part that's fascinating to me, is how a simple symbol like what you showed, just that white background and that purple center, and then a white six white wampum in the middle of that, to indicate a dish, and that white being represent in this kind of binary way, white representing peace, and purple representing, some would say, war or troubles, and then those six white beads in the middle of that bowl representing the beaver's tail, which back then, and to some people still now, is a delicacy, and that's the best part that you're offering to the other people. So what doesn't really get mentioned a lot of times is people will say it is called a dish with one spoon, of course, and that beaver tail is in there. But what they don't mention oftentimes is that when the Haudenosaunee extended that to us, they said, we give you the beaver tail, the best part. We know that it's a delicacy. So there's more to the diplomacy and the metaphoric language that's in there, that accompanies the actual belt. But like I said, when we see that belt, we don't really think of it. You if you just come and look at it on its own, you don't get all that much meaning from it. You have to actually have that belt with it, and you have to have that talk, and you have to talk to each other to convey that meaning. And then once you get that meaning, then it's interesting to me that how old this concept is, because that dish with one spoon, the I think I haven't proven this, but I think it has its part of it is tied to what the Huron people had before then, which is called the Feast of the Dead. And they had these great feasts of the dead, which they invited all the nations in their area that were allied to them, and even their enemies, to come and make peace. And when they did that, they disinterred some of their ancestors, and they brought whoever had passed away within the last 5 years, and they went and they made one common grave, and then they lined that all with beaver, what they call beaver blankets, beaver robes, and then they put in there all those bones from all the different people that came from all around the country, and there was like thousands of people that would go to these feasts of the dead. And they would put in different gifts, and wampum was one of those gifts that would be put in there with the beaver robe and the bones of the ancestors. And they said, by burying all our bones together of our ancestors, we're making peace on the other side, the spirit world, and on this side as well, so that it's these two are in working together. But here's the interesting part, and my point basically is that that Feast of the Dead in the Huron language, I can't say the word, but it was actually called the kettle. They didn't call it the Feast of the Dead. It was the Jesuits that called it the Feast of the Dead. But in their Huron language, they called it the kettle, that whole feast. And they have this whole metaphoric language going on. They would say the kettle is broken if they were actually going to have a feast and then somebody uh, disturbed the peace, and then that kettle is broken, so they actually couldn't have affect the peace. Or they would say the kettle is overturned, meaning they're not going to have that feast. And then if they said the kettle is over the fire, that's when they're saying they're going to have the feast is going to occur. So the Huron had all this language that went on with this Feast of the Dead. But again, this is the problem with English, and the problem with relying on colonial documents is that they changed the name to make meaning for themselves and to make meaning. The Jesuits changed the name and they changed the meaning. So when they were reporting back in the Jesuit relations to their superiors, this is how they would get them to understand what was going on. But they did say the Jesuits did record that the Huron called it the kettle. That's what that feast was called. So when you look at it as the dish with one spoon, all the different nations would call it the one kettle or the common pot, or it's the same. It's really the same thing, and that's when they're referring to the land as that one kettle or one pot, and that it means it's binding everyone all together. So there's a tie there that I think has to be explored further. That we haven't really taken it back that far to that feast of what the Jesuits named Feast of the Dead instead of calling it the kettle. So I don't know how much longer I'm supposed to.
I think that's great. I mean, Alan, thank you for really giving us, especially for some of our audience members who might not be familiar with that history of wampum, just the kind of development and complexity of symbols, and pinning it down geographically, and also pointing to those issues in terms of understanding these histories, and the limitations of some colonial documentation. So I think it would be great if we could bring in the artists at this moment, because I think the audience can now understand the basics of wampum and see how it's played out in the artist's work. So I know one of the questions I wanted to ask all of the artists on the panel was how and why are they using the wampum belt in their practice? And they're all doing it in different ways. So maybe you can turn to Jeff Thomas first. Jeff, welcome. And I'd like to ask for Jeff's slides to be put on as well so we can see some of his work.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm from, I was born in Buffalo, New York. My family is from the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm Onondaga, Turtle Clan. And I say my relatives are from Six Nations because I was born and raised in Buffalo. But my family, as a product of seeking work in the 1940s, quite often, many people from Six Nations migrated to Buffalo and then traveled back and forth. I I want to begin by talking about how the wampum belt became important in my work in terms of I had learned about it when I was a kid growing up. When I went to the reserve, I stayed with traditional longhouse people, relatives, and with my grandmother. And it was there that I began to hear stories that I would go back to Buffalo with, and I would wonder why aren't our stories being told back in the city in grade school? And quite often I asked teachers why. And one teacher in particular said, "Well, I can't tell you that, but someday you'll find your own answers." And although it seemed kind of harsh and dismissive at the time, my teacher was African American, And over time, I began to understand her response to my question. And that set the tone for what I would do as a photographer. I was interested in photographing different areas of my hometown on the reserve and powwow dancers, traditional male powwow dancers. And over time, I began to study the history of photography as well. And I found omissions that greatly alarmed me in terms of living in the shadow, I'll say, and that as an urban person, um, our stories weren't being told. We were kind of hidden in the shadows in a way. We were also part of that assimilation process as well, that our cultures were and histories weren't celebrated because we were supposed to be absorbed into mainstream society. That was the tension that I grew up with during my life because, as I said, my parents moved as children to Buffalo, grew up in the 40s and 50s, and they wanted to fit in. That was something that I didn't understand until I began working, curating an exhibition on residential schools. That the dynamic that I had to live with as a child, as a young person, as a teenager, I didn't fully understand because there was no talk about what was going on here. And then back on the reserve, when I was visiting relatives, they would talk about those who moved to the city and turned into white people. So these were kind of conversations. Well, these weren't conversations that weren't taking place, but I wanted to identify my existence in the urban world and that I wanted to add this to photography. The question was for me, and I think the great challenge was about the use of photography. I approached it very carefully because I was afraid of using the medium and then becoming something that I didn't intend to become. And I thought, will this just be another process or stream of thought in terms of assimilation? So I approached it carefully and I started to develop a practice. But the one thing that bothered me about photography is that there was no existing framework for me as an Indigenous person. I searched uh, for any person, any Indigenous person from the late 19th century to the early 20th century who was Indigenous. I didn't find anybody during that period of time. Now, we're talking about the late 1970s. Going into the 1980s, I was more moved about finding that framework that I could use that would really address the issues that I was looking at as an Indigenous person and urban based. And so I began looking at the wampum, at the Hiawatha Wampum Belt, which represents the formation of the Six Nations Confederacy or Haudenosaunee, as Lynda pointed out in the beginning. My elder had given me a rare written copy of the 1900 Six Nations Chiefs version of the Great Law. And my elder told me not to photocopy it because I was just starting university at the time. She said, don't forget what we have taught you. And she said, you have to copy it by hand. So it was about maybe 32 pages handwritten, and I did it. And it was embedded in my mind, and this is what I would come to understand. It wasn't to become an expert on the Hiawatha Wampum Belt, but it was about learning how to use those principles that they lived by as a photographer. So in the late or the mid 1990s, an exhibition was being curated by several curators that was on Iroquois beadwork. And I was invited to participate, and I didn't know what to do. So I eventually kind of moved towards the Hiawatha Wampum Belt. And so, as you can see here on this version, this wall tag, is that I used the white lines as frames. And I inserted my photographs that I found of statues or monuments that had Iroquois people into these frames. And this was my first way of kind of looking at the history combined with the present and talking about the urban world. And so that would lead to a work that I titled Cold City Freeze. And originally, you can see in the 5 boxes in the center here is that you had the Chief Red Jacket, Seneca, and then in Montreal, Place d'Armes with the Iroquois figure. In the center is the Onondaga. It marked the Onondaga village, which was just outside of Buffalo. And then Joseph Brant in Brantford, Ontario. And then I found this one, this last one, Seneca man named Gustawa, I think his name was. And he was involved in the Revolutionary War on the British side. And so this in Pittsburgh, Ohio, this monument kind of commemorates the conversation between the British and this particular Seneca chief. So it over the years, I kind of formulated this in different iterations, and as I found and learned more and more about public statues and monuments, I would switch these and eventually settled on this combination. But it wasn't enough to just have this. It was what I found, and as Alan was speaking about, was the wampum keeper and the importance of speaking about what I produced as a photographer. And this is when I began to think about the wampum belt as kind of uh, a pattern for utilizing and displaying my works. And over time, I went back to Buffalo numerous times, but I also grew up with the understanding that Buffalo was formerly known as the Buffalo Creek Territory or reservation. And it was kind of a post-Revolutionary War place for a lot of Indigenous people in New York State that had been displaced by the American Revolutionary War, in particular the Mohawk. And it became a great meeting ground in the late 18th century and into the 19th century, and then into the early 20th century. It began to break down over time. Joseph Brant led some of my ancestors to Six Nations, and the remains stayed at Buffalo Creek, which was eventually dissolved to the point that today there was one parcel left that now is the Seneca Creek Casino. So, and it's right in downtown Buffalo. But this was the idea for me, was to look at the history and to keep that in the background, to use the wampum belt as a metaphor of working, of my own kind of need to speak about the works that I produced. And so I can describe all of the photographs that I made over time. Now, what you'll note here, the last iteration that took place 2 years ago, on the left-hand side is a portrait of Captain Cold, who was an Onondaga, who was given a small tract of land to himself, and because of his role as the firekeeper of the Six Nations Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee. And this is a portrait that I wanted to add to this because his name was a part of the original title, Cold City Freeze. And then on the right-hand side is a cob of corn that I photographed. And it represents the importance of corn in our culture. And also, too, a similarity to the way in which the wampum belt looks with the beads itself, and to a new reading in terms of what does this all mean to us as Indigenous people, of defining new territory, of casting light where shadows had existed, and saying that we're here, that we may not speak the language, we may not participate in ceremonies. Nonetheless, we live within our DNA, this Indigenous component that needs to be defined and talked about. As I mentioned with my childhood growing up, why was I so disillusioned with my parents? And it was because we were going in different directions. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much for that, Jeff. If the slide could be advanced, I want to turn to Alan Mickelson. Alan, can you tell us a bit more about how and why you're using wampum in your works?
Sure, and it's Michaelson, by the way.
Michelson, my
Um,
apologies.
yeah. So my practice is context driven and site specific. And in the summer of 2004, I had a residency at Six Nations. Um, People on my mother's side are from Six Nations. I didn't grow up there, but I was having a show at the Woodland Cultural Center later that summer, and I was looking at the Grand River, which, if you know anything about our reserve, is a sort of diaspora from our original homelands in the Mohawk Valley, in the case of my people, Mohawk. Um, and it was a grant by the Crown to replace the land that was taken from us after the American Revolution and during the American Revolution. So I was looking at the Grand River, which is, a sort of a lazy river that um, we once supposedly had 6 miles on either side of the river from mouth to source. So like 1 million acres that's been reduced to, maybe 5% of what it was. And I was talking to my cousin, Rick Hill, about the river and about how rivers figured in our culture, how they were promoting sociability and social contact. They were the highways of our culture. And so our villages were often not right on the river, but near enough that people could visit each other by river travel. And I got interested after talking to Rick about that in how the river has become a fence and how rivers become borders. There's the international border. The St. Lawrence has become an international border between the US and Canada. And the Grand is a sort of border between the reserve and the non-Indigenous townships on the other side. So I got out on the river. I sort of scouted it by boat and also by car with Tom Hill, who was the director of the museum at the time. And and I noticed that there was this Grand River cruise boat, this dinner cruise boat that plies the river. And I thought I had done a panoramic video piece about a destroyed creek where I live in New York City. And and that was the first piece I did where I shot panoramic video, miles of it, of a riverbank. So I'd had experience doing that, and I asked permission of the Canadian tour boat company, of this Grand River Tour Company, if I could shoot from their boat, and they allowed me to do that. And I wanted it to be very wide and belt-like. One of the things I love about wampum belts is not only its strong symbolic and diplomatic sort of role, but also just visually how striking they are and how deceptively simple they are. Alan was referring to the sort of simple glyphs that are usually featured in the belts. And this one is probably the most simple one. This is based on the two-row wampum, which is quite important to the Haudenosaunee. It represents the original agreement between us and the Dutch and the other Europeans who were sort of moving into our territory. Um, and the idea was it was two purple rows on a white field, and they each represented the path of a ship on the same river, a Haudenosaunee canoe and a European sailing ship. And the agreement was to not try to steer each other's vessels or take over or try to, um, impede the other. And it was also an image with the parallelism of the two rows of equality, of parity and mutual respect and peace. So that, of course, is broken down. That agreement, original agreement, was violated, multiply, certainly by the other side, by the colonial side. And so I thought it'd be a really interesting vehicle for me to look at the river and look at the two sides of the river. So on the top, you see the footage I shot looking at non-Haudenosaunee townships on one side of the river. And on the bottom, you see footage I shot of the Haudenosaunee side. And I had them traveling there. It's a 4-channel video, so that's like 15 meters long. The piece. I wanted it to be very enveloping. I noticed the similarity also between panoramic format and wampum belts, and I sort of capitalized on that in these works. Also in the beautiful palette, the simple palette of purple and white, wampum is made from, clamshell, clamshells. The purple comes from the quahog clamshell, and the white used to come from the whelk. Um, and and just that palette is so strong and beautiful and represents so much. There's so much metaphoric and visual potential for an artist in a wampum belt. And I saw the sort of pixels as pixels of the video as being a sort of rendering of beads, sort of an updated rendering of the beads in a wampum belt. That's another thing that I love about wampum belts is that they're really communally constructed. You know, uh, it represents a community gathering those shells for food and then recycling them eventually, and are trading for them to create beads. And if you wanted to just do a simple symbol of like two purple rows on a white field, you could do that easily with paint or some other less laborious, less precise way of doing it. So if you think about the amount of beads and the amount of work that it takes to create a wampum belt, even with a simple figure like that, you get an idea of the sort of communal emphasis that it has. You know, it really represents that one image is made up of hundreds of beads. Um, just like to me, there's a connection between that and individuals and their nations, that the sense of back and forth between the individual and the communal. So anyways, they're traveling in different opposite directions in my video, and I had four stereo soundtracks to play with. So I recorded sound off the boat. So I have the sound of the river and the engines and whatever was taking place on shore and whatever was taking place on the boat, the dinner cruise boat, and the captain, the Canadian tour boat captain's travelogue, which in many cases really differed from Haudenosaunee understandings of the river. So I located his soundtracks. I like to play with the effects of spatial effects with work. So you have this enveloping work that's 15 meters long, and the soundtrack of the captain and his recitation of explanation of the territory around Six Nations, including Six Nations, is at the far right. And then on the far left, I invited the community to come to the radio station and just talk to me about the river, and recorded those conversations. So that's going on the extreme left. So if you want, and then the ambient sound from the river and the dinner cruise are in the middle. So if you come in, it's cacophonous. It's polyphonic, But if you move along the screen, you can isolate different sounds, and you can isolate the captain's description of the river, which is in many cases such opposition to the elders and the other people that are recorded on the other side. So wampum, I just appreciate it so much, for its not only for its diplomatic role but also its beauty. A lot of times with our stuff, the physical has a metaphysical role. It doesn't remain merely physical. It has metaphoric and metaphysical aspects. And wampum is one of those things where the white really stands for something that's positive and light, and the dark stands for something that's dark. And there's that mix in life, and it's reflected in the wampum. And I just thought it would be, this is the first work, but not the last that I've done using the two-row. I did a public artwork at the Canadian border at the station at Akwesasne, coming in from Cornwall, Ontario to Messina, New York, um, as a still, as a window. But same thing, I got out in the boat and I shot like miles of shoreline of the four shorelines at that crossing. And in a way, I'm showing that in this case, the diplomacy was a failure, despite the good intentions maybe of both sides in the beginning. I think what we have to reckon with is that uh, these agreements were not always entered into in good faith on the colonial side. They were opportunistic. They were cynical. They were basically, until we don't worry about you as a military force, we'll observe this. But once we couldn't back up um, our laws in a way with force, and our sovereignty wasn't recognized, then it was a free for all, and that's the situation that we've been enduring for the last more than 200 years. Is that good?
Amazing.
Is that enough?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you. And I know you have other slides, and we can get to those in our next round of questioning. But I really like to bring in Scawanati now. So I'd ask that Scawanati's slides get put up. Scawanati, yeah, please share with us, yeah, how and why you're using the wampum belt in your practice.
Sego Sego Guego. Yeah, I am Ganyangehaga or Mohawk from a reserve very close to where I'm at right now. I'm in downtown Montreal at Concordia University at Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, which is a research lab that I co-founded with my partner, Jason Edward Lewis. And I feel like I can just point to Kahnawake right across the St. Lawrence that we've been mentioning over here. I can't remember when I first saw a wampum belt or the symbols related to a wampum belt. I mean, in Kahnawake, which is where I was born, there are, paintings like graffiti, like Jeff showed, of the Confederacy belt around. The two-row wampum is very familiar to me. But what I definitely remember is going web surfing. Remember when we called it surfing? Looking for wampum and finding Darren Bonaparte's Wampum Chronicles online. And this gentleman is from Akwesasne, and he's Mohawk from Akwesasne, and he's been learning and teaching everybody about wampum belts for a long time. And he goes around and he does these wonderful talks where he's got these wampum belts hanging, and he talks about each one, and it's so fantastic. And so I chased him down after one of his talks one time. And I was like, can I touch one? And he showed me these different wampum belts, and he showed me one that was made of real wampum. So one more thing I want to add to all this, there's so much to say. It's so hard for us to talk about all this stuff in these short little capsules. But a wampum means one bead and one string of the beads and a whole belt of the beads. And, in addition to all the labor that Alan Michelson mentioned, to make one bead took a significant amount of time because they had to be drilled in a certain way. And wampum were even called a kind of money at one time because they had this value. Like it took maybe, I don't even know how long it took because I've never done it, but maybe an hour to make one bead or maybe 10 minutes. I don't know. Anyhow, they're very expensive still today now. If you want to buy one wampum bead, they cost like probably $2 each. And so here I am with Darren, and he has this beautiful wampum belt made of real wampum shells, and I touch it, and it's magical to touch it. It's like it's smooth and cold, and people talk about how it represents the river as well because it comes from a creature of the river. Anyway, he has these other ones too. And these are made, and I have one here for you, which of course you can't touch, but he shows me this wampum belt. This is one that I asked my cousin to make for me because I have a long story that I'm probably not going to tell all of, but these are made of Fimo. So Darren says to me, well, we make them out of Fimo now because the real wampum are so expensive. And if you don't know what Fimo is this kind of plastic clay that you can buy to make crafts with. And I mean, as soon as he said that, I'm like, well, why are we making them in just purple and white then? I want the sparkly wampum. I want the pink wampum. And so I set out to buy so I bought a whole bunch of Fimo and I utterly failed at making my own beads, my own Fimo wampum beads. I couldn't make them. They would break and they would fall out, they would get stuck on the wire. Anyway, it didn't work out for me. So I ended up deciding to make one so then I searched the internet again. And this is years have passed in all this time because basically I decided I was thinking a lot about wampum when I made the Peacemaker Returns, which I'll show you later in the next question. But I was thinking of all these wampum belts that I wanted to make. And I thought, well, I actually need to kind of make a timeline of wampum belts. So that's what you're just about to see now coming up in these slides. So this is the Confederacy belt, which we think is probably from the year 1100. There's the Tura wampum belt. And then I made this belt, which was I imagined in a very near future we would make an empowerment wampum belt. And so, like the belt that Alan referred to, Alan Corbière, I think you're referring to the one where they're all, not holding hands but linking arms. Well, they could look like they're holding hands to me, and I was like, well, but their hands are down. And so, empowerment, it's like the same belt, but just their hands are up. And then I start to introduce the color because I'm imagining in the far future we use these belts in our meetings with extraterrestrial peoples. And so I was able to find, thank goodness, on the internet, colored beads shaped like wampum. So they do call them wampum beads because now also wampum has another meaning, which is the long tubular beads, like just 8 millimeters long about. And so yeah, I thought it was a really, so I should also say another way to start talking about my work is that I'm very interested in Indigenous people in the future. I want to show us thriving. I want to contemplate who we will be in the future, what we'll look like, why, what things do we bring forward and what things do we leave behind? So, our people, I think a lot of us, we really long for our past. We think we were interrupted and that we were on a very good path. But the truth is there were some rotten things we did or some dumb things we did as well. And maybe we don't want to remember those and maybe we don't want to bring them in the future. But the things that we do want to bring are like cool things like wampum belts, cool things like the Ohandu Gariwat, which is our Thanksgiving address, which teaches us to practice or reminds us to practice gratitude on a very regular basis. The Peacemaker was a pretty cool guy. These are things that we'd like to talk about. And the Peacemaker, in one story, it was the Peacemaker who invented the wampum. The wampum belt. There's a lot of stories about that actually. I really think that I could say a lot more, but that's the encapsulated nugget of the answer that I want to give you.
I love that. Thank you so much, Kawanati. I mean, I think it's great to, there's obviously so much that all of the panelists can speak to, but I'm really glad to see you also emphasize the futurity, which is so prominent in your work. And Lynda was just messaging me and suggested maybe just looking at our time, we keep with the artists, and think about this question about histories of diplomacy, and then pivoting to Alan Corbière after that. Okay, Lynda, I see you nodding. Great. Okay, so I mean, I think one thing that we want to talk to the artists about today, about their work, is how it's reflecting these histories of Indigenous diplomatic practices. And Skawanati, you've just raised the peacemaker, the Great Law of Peace, all these elements that are foundational to Haudenosaunee diplomacy. So maybe what we can do is go back to Alan Michelson. I'd like to just ask the artists to respond in terms of how the history of wampum is mobilized in their work. I know this is something we started to get at with the first question, but it'd be great to hear from all three artists once more. So Alan Michelson, over to you. And if you'd like, we can get your slide back up to show that second image.
Well, I was wondering if you could maybe go on to the second image.
Yeah.
because this
Absolutely.
is the result of a failure of diplomacy, that what I'm going to talk about.
Okay, so I will just message our tech that we would like yep, here we go. Is this right,
Yeah,
Alan? Great, thanks.
yes. So this is a work I did also in advance of a show at Woodland Cultural Center, this time from 2018. And I think about land a lot, and I think about it not only in terms of spatial topographical aspects, but also its temporal aspects, its history. And I was thinking about how we had been forced out of our homelands in what's now most of New York State, um, uh, particularly in the wake of and during the American Revolution, which we tried to stay out of. We, Haudenosaunee, tried hard to stay out of that, but we're not really allowed to by the warring parties. And it split the Confederacy to a degree. Two of our six nations stood with the Americans, and my ancestors, the Mohawk and others, stood with the longtime allies, the Brits. And at a certain point, George Washington, who was then the commander of the Continental Army, decided to plan and execute probably the biggest campaign of the American Revolution, probably the most expensive and the one that had the most personnel and the most uh, the many armies activated, which was the Sullivan. It's called the Sullivan Campaign or the Sullivan Expedition of 1779, which basically sent. Well, first there was an army sent in the spring, but in the summertime, that's sort of late summer, three armies converged and basically just uh, did a scorched earth campaign throughout Iroquois, throughout our homelands. They burned over 50 villages. We weren't hunter-gatherers. We were agricultural people with established farms who had orchards and all sorts of things going that were utterly destroyed. Purposely, Washington's orders called for the utter devastation of their country and for the capture of as many men, women as possible and stuff like that. It was a real genocidal campaign. And I just realized that not only did our people not necessarily as familiar as they could be about this campaign, which had so changed everyone's lives. But certainly uh, people who weren't Haudenosaunee and people, let's say, in New York City or in New York State really weren't aware of how all that land, millions of acres of land came into possession of the state and possession of out of our possession, how we were dispossessed of it. So I took this replica bust of Washington that was done by a French sculptor, Houdon, around that time, around that time, a little after that time. Um, and I projected all this history of the campaign onto the bust as a video. And there was a battle map that showed the uh, action of the campaign, which I panned over and goes on his face, and it almost looks like native face painting at times. Um, and when it reached a village that his troops destroyed, I looked for and I found all these markers, these state historical markers that were installed in 1929, which was the 150th anniversary, sort of celebrating this campaign of genocide that New York was doing. So this is one of those signs. This is just a still from the video installation projected onto the bust. And I very much think that history, taught in schools and so forth, can be very dry. But history taught, or not taught exactly, but history that's available a different framework, in an artistic framework, can do more because it's emotional and it involves the heart as well as the head. And it's not dry dates. It's actually, quite um, powerful. So that's all I want to say about that.
Thank you so much. Now let's go to Jeff. Jeff, I wonder if you want to talk a bit more about Indigenous diplomatic practice and how the history of wampum is mobilized in your work. And would you like us to bring up the slides again?
Yes, you can do that. I realized I hadn't really commented on the graffiti
Great.
wampum belt. But I just wanted to start by picking up on 2 points, and first with Ellen with the Sullivan campaign. When I was watching what is going on in the Middle East, it wasn't that hard to think about how it was in much the tradition of what happened with what was going on with the Sullivan campaign, what happened to displaced Haudenosaunee people, and how many people actually starved that winter, and how many people had to flee their homeland and end up going to, as I mentioned in my previous remarks, to the Buffalo Creek Reservation and what transpired there. So, it's like we look at these histories and we see them repeated over and over again. So, and I also wanted to mention what Skanawati was talking about too, is that the importance of realizing that what we learn was never frozen in time. It was the Europeans and their forms of collection that froze ceremonies and things in time, encapsulated in museums and collections and things like that. There was that great rush to capture the last remnants of the vanishing tribal people. And so anthropologists were going all over Turtle Island trying to get as much information as they could. And then you had the traditional people who were also kind of protecting those ways. And so we have this other dynamic that's going on. And it's important to understand that it's not us who are frozen in time. So how do we survive? How do we think about our children and the coming generations in terms of what we speak about today? And what I'll say is that when I was speaking about this Iroquois beadwork exhibition, one of the curators was concerned about my use of the Hiawatha Wampum Belt. So she organized a meeting at Six Nations with Tom Hill, discussing with other people whether or not this is going to raise some controversy. So she wanted to head it off ahead of time. But it was interesting because, in one sense, it gave me a sense of going ahead with my work. And what happened and what subsequently happened is that I produced over 90 of the type of belts that you've seen, like with the Cold City Freeze and that, because I found that, like with the Cherokee and Sequoia, when he developed uh, a language that they could use to deal with colonialism, I found the similar kind of feeling when I started working with the wampum belt, and that it wasn't so much about recreating the history of our people, but looking to the future. And I was able to continually be inspired to write, to put together new panels. And so now it's the formation of my exhibition that just opened here in Ottawa at the Ottawa Art Gallery called The Stories My Father Couldn't Tell Me. And it includes a new series of what I call now dream belts into the exhibition space. So what I didn't finish speaking about with this particular photograph was that I was driving on Highway 17, I think it was, going north to North Bay to attend a conference. And I was just outside the small town of Arnprior. And it was raining that day, and I just kind of caught this out of my left peripheral vision. I looked at it and I thought, was that a wampum belt? And so I made a point of when I returned that I find it again and stop and confirm that it actually is what I thought it was. And it was. And the question is why is it there of all places in Arnprior? There's no, what I could find, no traditional historical place there that is important to our people. It was a great mystery. And over time, I was reading the newspaper and found out that Arnprior has some of the oldest living white pine trees in the area. So my son and I made a road trip back to Arnprior, and this is when I photographed the wall with the graffiti on it. And so we started looking around, and we ended up going into the Arnprior Cemetery. And it was almost like this natural cathedral because there were white pine trees clustered in certain parts of the cemetery. And you would stand back, and I could understand why it became such a central symbol on the Hiawatha Wampum Belt, which is the tree of peace. And so it has many layers of significance to our people as a symbol of unity. And how do you proceed forward from that as a unified people? And so it was quite an interesting point to think that, well, if there is a connection between the graffiti on Highway 17 and the white pine trees, who did that? And it was fascinating to me because then I began looking, pulling up in front of this rock wall and looking at the wampum belt, but also looking down the highway and the white lines that went down the highway. And so things began to percolate in my mind in terms of, wow, there's something really interesting going on here, and I'm forced to look at this very differently, or somebody is pointing it out to me. And so that's how my work with the wampum belt proceeded. But it was never to, make my own belts in terms of talking about Indigenous history all the time, but also talking about photography and the role that it plays, and as a device to recall, to think, to remember, to think critically, and with an imagination is what I learned. And so all of these components began coming into my life as wampum belt. And as my interest in wampum beads grew, I started looking and trying to buy some, and they are very expensive, the ones that are handmade. And so I have a jar, a small, very small jar of wampum beads that are made from the shells, but at some point I'll include them in a future work. But for now, this is the role that the work has played, and I think it's important too to recognize the act of diplomacy in terms of communication to an outside audience to say that what you think about Indigenous people is also rooted in stereotypes. So begin thinking not about how I look or what I say, but how I see. How do I see the world that's around me? And so this is the significance of the works that I produce.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Yeah, I love how you think about wampum as a device through which to think critically, through which to think creatively. And I want to turn to Skawanati. And Skawanati, I'd love to hear from you. And would it be a good moment now to show that short clip that you'd like to share of The Peacemaker Returns?
It will be in 1 minute because I just have to tell this to Jeff before I forget.
Yeah, yeah.
Jeff, I'm gonna have a show and I was gonna call it Dream House. Welcome to my dream house. So I just want you to know that now because I didn't know about dream belts, but I think that's an amazing name.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll set up the quick clip very quickly though. I want you all to know what you're looking at. It's a technique. What you're going to see is not an animation. It's a technique of shooting film, shooting a movie inside a virtual environment. And if you are at all familiar with massively multiplayer online worlds, this is a very famous one. It's called Second Life. And so the reason I use this particular software or platform is because it's very customizable. And so I can really customize the avatars. I can create environments. I can change the lighting, and I can upload things that I make into that world for people to for the characters, the actors, the avatars to interact with. So that's what you're looking at. It's a 2-minute trailer of a 20-minute long little movie. And let's just play and see what happens. My name is Yodet Sa'a, and I live on Earth, usually. Until recently, life on Earth had been very good. The goal of our mission is to create a union. I have been invited on this historic voyage because I have a special power. I'm a dreamer. I see the past perfectly. Wish us luck. You can stop it now because this goes on kind of a long time. It goes on like about 10 more seconds. So what's happening in that movie is I did some research, more research into the peacemaker, who is our historical slash mythological figure who brought peace to the original five Haudenosaunee nations that were, and up until that point at war for as long as anyone could remember. And what I thought was so interesting was that this person was able to do that, and that he didn't. So he was very interesting to me. Like he's like Jesus plus plus, like because Jesus said, "Turn the other cheek," and Deganawida said, "Treat everyone like family." And these metaphors that Alan and everyone was talking about is like it's so beautiful when you start to open your mind to the Haudenosaunee metaphors. Like so our name, the Haudenosaunee, which is actually not in the Mohawk language, that's in the Onondaga language for, is the people of the Longhouse. And that's a metaphor that the peacemaker brought us to say that like if we look at this territory, it could be like we're one family living in one extended family living in a longhouse. So I don't know if it was the first wampum belt, but that's like the first one. That's the earliest one that I know about this Confederacy wampum belt. So I think the wampum belt is a mnemonic device. Like it stands for the treaty, the agreement, the moment, but it also I used it in that piece to show like I forgot what I was going to say. Damn it. Sorry. But I used it to show, anyway, darn it. I really had a good sentence going there, but I can't remember it. It'll come back to me eventually. Yeah, it's like in the clip you see multiple instances of wampum belts, and you can see how they sort of they evolved over time. Again, just like Alan Corbier was talking about, like always our people, and this is one of the things I would love if we had time to converse about, is like always our people were able to we evolved. All cultures evolve, and we were no different in that way. And you know, I think the my co-panelists know this very well, but perhaps the people listening don't know that we consider ourselves as people who use new technology like when it came to us that we were eager to use it and to try it and to incorporate it into our lives. And so I feel very lucky because Jeff talked about I don't know who this person was, this curator who might think you might not be allowed to use your own symbol, but that happens a lot. Like our own people will say to us, you can't do that. You can't show this. But thankfully, my family always was like, you're Mohawk. It's yours just as much as it's theirs. Why, why do you're allowed to use it. So I've always felt I've had permission. And well, even deeper, I would say I don't feel I have to ask for permission. What I do is I ask my elders or my knowledgeable people around me if, what do you think about this? Do you think it would offend anybody? What's the part that's offensive to you? Like I showed, Sky Woman as an alien. That's something that my cousin who made that wampum belt, she said, who might not like that part. So I had to think, okay, do I want the trouble of my own community getting mad at me? Is it worth it? And I thought, I think they're going to be fine. I think they're not going to be that mad at me. So I did it. And that was She Falls for Ages, for those of you who know. And I showed her, she's still very beautiful and she's humanoid. She's just a little, she's a little bit alien, you know? And like mostly I get fantastic responses to that work from my community, from the Mohawk community and the Indigenous community at large. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered the question because I got really turned around by forgetting my little bit of my sentence, but I think just by, bringing that peacemaker into the peacemaker and, he as the originator of the wampum belt, maybe, but like the evolution of the wampum belt and the evolution of diplomacy. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The main thing I wanted to say is that what Deganawida taught the people was very valuable. And yes, like Jesus, he said, he had this great saying, but he also backed it up with teachings of consensus. He also, some say that he also established the clan system so that we could learn how to figure out our differences in the longhouse. And so I think that that's like an incredible thing that we should try to recapture and get like out there for people. Let's how to resolve differences. And I think we should have a Peacemaker AI coming up next soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gawanati. Let me jump in here and pivot things back to Alan Corbier. Alan, I'm going to take we have a number of wonderful questions in the chat, and I just want to present one to you from Bradley Clemens, who's a Settler Museum scholar and practitioner, who has a really interesting question where he talks about museums separating wampum from wampum talk, and those two things being separated. And then he suggests that maybe these artists are reanimating or vitalizing the wampum by the ways in which they're using it and speaking to it in their work. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things I like from all three artists, well, I always like talking to artists, and one of the fellows I guess that I would have liked to include in this kind of panel, and I know that Scawanati knows this fella, Michael Belmore. He would make wampum belts out of aluminum and copper. But one of the things here that I like about what the artists are doing is it kind of coincides with this lady that had written a book called Queequeg's Coffin, and Birgit Rasmussen. One of the things that just struck me that she had talked about was the different orientation of wampum and paper. And she said with the indigenous people accepting or making wampum, they were accepting and thinking that they were entering into a relationship that was beginning. The giving of a wampum belt was the start of a relationship. And she says that had to be renewed and periodically and remembered. Whereas paper treaties were the ones where it's signed, sealed, the deal is done, and that's it, it's over. But when you look at these belts and like what Jeff showed there with the Haudenosaunee, the Hiawatha belt, that both ends extend out, that it doesn't, it actually looks like it's going to keep going. And we have these belts that are called road belts. And of course, that 2 row is also a road, what we would call a road belt. And the road belt means there's no beginning and no end. And so what I find these artists are doing is actually bringing this back up into our community as well as raising a historical conscious, but also artistic aesthetic that is based on traditions. And then what Bradley's question was, of course, is that you're separating the two, you're separating the talk from the actual belt. And this is what one of the Bradley's part of this project that also I'm part of. It's called Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Art and Culture. And basically, whenever people went around collecting stuff, like anthropologists and ethnologists, ethnographers, they collected the belts and then they deposited them in a museum. But then their field notes get stored at an archive or a different place. So what ends up happening is this scattering of information that and then of course an auction house later on is actually put some of the material up that is now accessible to us because of the power of the internet. But bringing all these back together, to me, bringing back the talk and the belt and whatever the collector was thinking, as well as the stories that people continue to tell, and then what artists are doing is trying to bring those back together in a more creative fashion that's more impactful. And I like what Alan Mickelson said that history is in high school can be just a dry iteration of dates, but presenting that history with combining it with art may make it more impactful. And like when I was a kid growing up, I never actually thought I was going to be a historian. That was never even a thought. And it was only once I started to see how much of that history, like what Jeff talks about, and like I like his the title of his exhibit, the things my father couldn't or didn't tell me. And it says the same with me. Like I grew up with this big glaring omission. But here, what we're in a time of is actually looking at all of these items, wampum belts, and these and some of these belts, the talk has been separated that we don't know what they actually can that the talk doesn't go with the belt anymore. And there was just a profuse amount of belts exchanged in Niagara in 1764 and at subsequent great peace gatherings. And so it's going to take a lot more work to actually bring the talk back to match it with the belt. And then, of course, these belts get repurposed. And this again goes back to this idea of what the artists are doing is our people back then, even in this 18th century, were taking belts and taking them apart because the beads were so valuable and so much labor went into making them that they then took them apart and actually rewove them for a new purpose. And that's kind of in a sense what's going on is that the new purpose is basically our time and era, this modern era that we're in. We're actually taking a lot of these images and playing with those images and to make new meaning. And it's still based upon a traditional system. And it may not be this system that is stuck. And one of the books I've read, I liked how this fellow talked about the oral tradition, is that what non-native people think, especially in the courts, is that oral tradition is a jukebox, that I could just go up to Jeff Thomas and I press him and then he just recites the great law for 10 days. Or I do the same with Mickelson. I press a button on Mickelson and he talks about the two-row wampum uh, as it was handed down. But what these guys are doing is kind of not, they're actually reconfiguring that meaning and making it more an effective, uh, trying to heighten its effectiveness to modern people and young people particularly, so that they add on to that and they latch on to that symbol, and then they say, "Yeah, I'm part of this. This is part of me now, and I'm going to take it." And like what I like what Scavanati just said, you're a Mohawk. You don't have to ask permission. But you do have to stay within. I'm lost for words, but other than good taste, I guess. At this point that you can't really go and do whatever you want, but you there is still community norms and expectations of what that symbol means and what you can and can't do with it. But within that area, you can actually expound upon it and take it to new areas to be explored. And I just like what Mickelson did with that video of the on the Grand River and making this contrast with the video and playing around with playing around with landscapes and trying to transpose that landscape on belts because we have belts that actually depict specific places as well. And of course, we didn't even touch on this. That's although Scavanati did mention it, that does represent the Haudenosaunee territory, that Hiawatha belt with each of those, the eastern door, the western door, and of course you guys all know this. But anyway, that's the thing, and that to me is what I look at, what that symbol of that rectangle being the mat, being a group's territory, as well as not only their bed, their country, but also their territory. So there's a lot to ignite the imagination with, and these artists are doing a good job, even when like Jeff says, it just catches his eye, and maybe it wasn't a wampum belt, but that's just his proclivity. When he sees something, he thinks, "Oh, is that a belt?" And then he turns around and looking for cultural meaning in spaces that perhaps you wouldn't expect it. Is what we are, I think, what the artists are doing here, and me as a practicing historian, as well as trying to get people to recognize these symbols and to look for these symbols in different, not just on belts, but like I said, on pipes, on the clothing back then, and on treaties and petitions, and all the material culture that we ever used and made. And of course, for Anishinaabe people, it's painting on cliff faces and pounding them into quartzite rock uh, in different areas as well. So there's a lot to for us to explore, and a lot of we've been given a lot to actually ignite our imaginations to make more meaning and make it more interesting for our people, because this was hidden from us for too long. I forgot the question.
You know, you know what you've done though, Alan, is I really appreciate how you've kind of pulled the thread across all of the artists and kind of tied the circle in our conversation. And I'm so pleased too that you talked about this affective impact of the artist's work, because I know for Lynda and I, it's really, this idea that this work made by the artist is engaging audiences, prompting deeper reflection and learning. Like it's not just illustrative. I can't, you put it better than I could, but I think that's a perfect spot in which we could end our conversation today. So I really want to thank all of our panelists, historian Alan Corbiere, artist Alan Michelson, Scawanati, Jeff Thomas. I've learned a lot about your work and about wampum today. I'm grateful that you could share your experiences with us. I only wish we had more time to keep talking. So I'm very grateful to you for being here. And I'm also thankful to our audience. Thank you so much. There's been a really lively chat. Thanks to everybody for putting those links in to Jeff's exhibition, Grassack, and more. And thank you for the questions as well. Please be sure to keep in mind that the ICRRA conference is continuing. There are other events coming up, and the next one is on November 6th at 10 a.m. CET, which is Berlin time. And this is a panel discussion titled Interrupting Epistemologies of Cultural Relations and Policies. So thank you again on behalf of the ICRRA network. I hope everybody enjoys their day. Take care.